seafood. So it's basically what that comes down to. Linda, thank you so much, and everyone in your organization and all those standing behind you and your team. This is a really very compelling gathering, and I have certainly learned a lot, and you are certainly performing a great service for our nation and populace. So, JC, thanks for that awesome presentation as well. You're always inspiring, as are so many of the other presenters. My name is Barton Seaver. I consider myself a recovering chef and restaurateur. I had 7 restaurants here in the Washington, D.C. area. I was born and raised in this town as well. I was very interested in sustainable seafood, coming to it from a culinary standpoint. I was inspired by Alice Waters, the Dan Barber, some of the great chefs, Rick Moonen certainly. Looking at, I as a chef, how do I serve the best quality products? Well, I create relationships. And then I translate those relationships onto the plate using the best quality ingredients I can find. I got very interested in the sustainable part of this. And so I had opportunity to walk away from restaurants at a certain point, and I took a job as an explorer with the National Geographic Society. And that is about as sexy of a job as you can imagine it being. My job description was go somewhere, do something fun, and then tell somebody about it. It was like, and you're funding this too? Cool. Like, this is great. And talk about needing a visa. No, you got a little rectangular golden halo with you. You get in anywhere. It was amazing. When I went out into the world for about 7 years, I was working in marine conservation, and I thought that my purpose was to decrease our impact on marine ecosystems. And I went out there with this holier-than-thou attitude, like, we are going to remove our footprint from the oceans. But what I very quickly realized is that our purpose is not to necessarily minimize our impact on oceans, but rather to maximize their impact on us. And that the end result of sustainability is the endurance of thriving human communities. And we are simply a product of resilient ecosystems. We cannot be resilient ourselves without resilient ecosystem services. That got me very interested in public health, and I had an opportunity for the last 6 years. I've been the director of the Health and Sustainable Food Program at the Harvard School of Public Health. And there we were looking at the macro impacts of seafood consumption, certainly with nutrition, but looking at how much aquaculture creates employment opportunities for women in developing nations. That's a huge opportunity with aquaculture. Looking at global greenhouse gas emissions, a lot of the great information that's been shared with us about sort of looking at seafood in the context of protein, because that's how we use it. So why don't we measure its sustainability as such? So comparing it to the other things that we eat. And so through this, I became very much a champion of seafood, to the point where I have left my position there to found the Coastal Culinary Academy. Because for the advocacy that I want to do, this is a far better place to do it. And my mission in life is to get more people eating more seafood across all demographics. And the very important part of that statement is the all demographics. In order to do that, we've heard some really great conversations about this. We all, I think, have very well understand why we need to be eating more seafood. So I want to talk about some of the barriers that we have to doing that. First and foremost, 70% of seafood that's eaten in America is eaten in restaurants. And so chefs have an outsized impact on how we consume fish, but also how we think about it. I mean, chefs are the arbiters of the narrative about food in this country. We've really become so in the last 20 years specifically with the advent of the celebrity chef, but also just there is now a food culture in America. It was chefs that introduced arugula. Do you remember 20 years ago walking into a grocery store, apples were red or green. Iceberg was the lettuce. Tomatoes were pink, cylindrical, and unripe all year round. But chefs introduced arugula, something that tastes like something. You walk into the most modest grocery store and there are 10 different kinds of apples now. Tomatoes, they're juicy, purple, pink, juice runs down your arm. Some of them are green and striped even when they're ripe and crunchy. I mean, these are things that were terrifying 20 years ago. Literally. But it was chefs that introduced us to this. And so chefs have this opportunity to talk about flavor, to talk about deliciousness, to talk about revitalizing our interest in seafood. But unfortunately, chefs lack seafood literacy. There are 476 post-secondary culinary degree programs in America, growing at a rate of 23% right now. There are high school vocational programs. Of these, I have not found more than one that has significant seafood content in their curriculum. Not one. So in my career, I hired over 350 chefs and cooks. I taught seafood at that one institute that has significant seafood content. I know exactly what chefs don't know about seafood because I spent my career filling in that gap. That was my opportunity, and that was my joy. We need to create content for these schools because we're not graduating generations of seafood evangelists. We're not supporting the industry to be the juggernaut of influence around seafood that we need it to be. And this lack of training is also furthered by the fact that there is an incredible labor shortage in restaurants. And a labor shortage is going to mean that we're going to move much towards convenience products in restaurants. Sous vide, ready packaged things, drop it in a bath of water and just wait till it's hot, open it up. I mean, this is how Olive Garden operates. Because they're not hiring necessarily a lot of talent. They're hiring, it's really a sort of a mechanical operation. And so if restaurants don't have the talent, they're going to move away from things that people can actually address and contribute to. And so we're at this sort of critical point right now where we have to create this generation of seafood evangelists to enter into the culinary workforce. There's something like 30,000 culinarian shortage projected by the year 2025. I mean, that is very, very significant. And we have a chance to touch them all through culinary programs. There's also, I think, a well-documented bias that we've heard a lot about today that's coming towards the chefs from consumers. I mean, dietitians, RNs, physicians, chefs themselves have a lot of lingering biases, a lot of that based on misinformation, and I got to be honest here, I peddled a lot of that misinformation, not misinformation, but information without context when I was a younger chef. I've learned more about how seafood actually fits in and why it matters now. But we don't necessarily have that opportunity to continuously educate those who are at the centers of these conversations. RNs, RDs. An example of this is my wife and I have a 2-year-old boy. And we were, before his birth, we were in her OB's office. And this is a place where men don't have anything to say other than, honey, I love you and I got your back. But the OB told my wife to avoid all seafood at all costs. I said, time out. Time out. I do have something to say on this one. And this is a very well-educated woman who is at the top of her profession. And that's the advice that she's giving out. She even had pamphlets that said so, that were distributed throughout her entire organization, which is about 300 doctors. Wow. And this is in the state of Maine, where seafood it's pretty close to home, right? So in addition to this, Haley Froelich, who I co-hosted that video with, and Michael Rubino from NOAA, who's just brilliant, he wrote a paper on the social impact, the impacts of social sort of acceptance on aquaculture, but it largely applies to seafood in general. And that is the biggest impediment to increasing aquaculture in the United States is the lack of social license. Social license being an understanding broadly in the public of the benefits brought to us by an industry. Now, you can sort of extrapolate that to be across the board about seafood. We simply don't have social license for it. We don't really understand its benefits, and if we do, we don't really understand it from a culinary perspective. We don't have a culture of seafood. And that's what really matters. Yeah, you can give somebody a recipe. Yeah, you can give them some information. But until we create the context in which seafood actually exists in their lives, we're not going to achieve the goals that I think we're all here to set out to achieve. Furthermore, we've had sort of fragmented industry efforts that are brand-based. And by fragmented, I don't mean negative at all. I mean, ASME has done incredible work to the point where Alaska on a menu is as trusted as any other brand. And in fact, their menu penetration is at the level of Grand Marnier, Jack Daniels, and Coca-Cola. Or, Black Angus beef. The only things above that are Coca-Cola. It's like, holy crap, that's amazing work that you've done. The unfortunate part of it is that ASME, sustainable seafood campaigns, healthy seafood campaigns, pro-farmed, pro-wild campaigns, what these are doing is selling the modifier, not seafood. And that modifier, they're all very important. Alaska has very compelling stories, very compelling stories. The health information is very important, but what do people end up buying? They end up buying the omegas, or they buy trust, which is really what we're purchasing from Alaska, and delicious. We know these things. But we are not elevating seafood as an entire category. And that's what we have the opportunity to do. Seafood is the only food that's considered guilty before proven innocent. I mean, have you ever asked if the pork is fresh? You know? Or if it has Fukushima radiation, or if it eats its own poop, or JC told me a new one today that I hadn't heard, so a couple days ago she had somebody tell her that the plastic bowls that she serves are made out of recycled VCRs, as though her fish is served with a sauce of the ghost of Sister Act 2. You know, it's like JC's comment. We have to struggle just to get people to neutral around seafood to the point where they then might decide to buy one of the things in the case. That's a really difficult position to be in. And the last obstacle that I'll mention, Scott mentioned this earlier and others have as well, is that going to that culture, we don't identify with fisheries. We very well know what a farm is. You know, we close our eyes, we imagine that farm, the undulating rolling hills, spinning off into autumn splendor, setting sun, red barn, white house, paint fading. I mean, we get this, the amber waves of grain, the fruited plain. We literally sing about this, right? It's the thread that weaves together our social fabric in America. And I ask you to close your eyes, though, and picture a fishery. Most people just kind of shrug. You know, and they think maybe they're standing on that dock gazing wistfully out at the wine dark sea, thinking that a fishery is something that happens beyond the horizon of our attentions, somewhere other. But you stand on that dock, and to see a fishery, you turn around, and you look at mortgages and public schools, the quality of education, the quality and opportunities that students have, that young people have, to follow in their footsteps, to stay placed, to take advantage of the economies provided by ecosystem services, for the ability for a daughter to follow in 5 generations of bootsteps to take helm of that lobster boat. That's a fishery. It is the sum of the labors and aspirations of a community. And when we see it as that, we see ourselves as potentially participating in that. We understand the civic virtues, the values. We give it social license. In order to do this, in order to address these obstacles, I'm going to educate chefs, RDs, RNs, policymakers, retail, industry members, anyone that we can in order to create this culture. So the Coastal Culinary Academy has 2 platforms. The first is an online platform, creating a 15-hour traditional culinary sort of university class. And this is just how to cook seafood, how to think about it. This is what seafood is. Because when you learn about seafood in a culinary institution, you use salmon to learn about grilling, but you never learn anything about the salmon or the char or the steelhead or the sockeye or the chum or the pinks or the dogs. You never learn about the fish. So we're going to reverse the order of operations there and provide this for anyone who wants it. By anyone who wants it, I mean Department of Defense, Marriott, Fairmont, Disney. Talking about hundreds of thousands of culinarians that we can touch by creating access to something. There's an immersive training program. And I should mention, the online platform is supported by my good friends at Beaver Street Fisheries, new generation of seafood company that's really eager to address sustainability and consumption efforts. The other aspect of this is an immersive training program. People come up to Maine, and Maine, it's place-based, but not place-purposed. But within an hour's drive of Portland, Maine, I can show you everything basically but lake-grown aquaculture, because it gets cold. But what we can do is you put you on a boat, pull mussel rafts, pull lobster traps, get on a dragger, go to the fish exchange, see this in action, meet the fishermen, create a context, create a story, and then learn about whatever you want. Wine pairing, sustainability, quality, and sensory analysis. You cook on-trend culinary things with me in a kitchen. You go home educated, inspired, and enlightened. Not to my story, but ultimately to your story. What we are doing, what we are creating is not a new program. We're not replicating what you are doing. We're trying to augment it. We're not rewriting anything, we're interpreting it so that the great work that you are doing ends up fitting into the context, the culture of people's lives, so that they may begin to espouse these virtues and social license themselves. Improved seafood literacy simply will cultivate positive public opinion. And what we need to do is enlist and mentor an articulate constituency of evangelists to speak the truths that we've been sharing today. Ultimately, the other thing, and I'll close on this, is it's very expensive to create audiences. And just like we're not rewriting your work, I'm not trying to create a new audience. That's very expensive, very time-consuming, and very risky. So we're going to use the audiences that already exist. We're working with GAA and through generous support of SNP to reach millions of people with the work. We're writing articles with Cooking Light. I'm working still with National Geographic, producing video shorts that are going to be interstitials on all of their channels that are going to touch tens of millions of people. American Culinary Federation, 12,000 chefs working in America that have to have continuing education credits. Every year they have to complete so many. And of over 4,000 hours of available content for continuing education, there is 1 hour of seafood content. Thank you, Asmi. It's your hour. There is literally nothing else for them to do. So we're going to provide it for them. National Restaurant Association, the good NRA, they have, they touch 65,000 purchasers arrive in Chicago at one point. What are we doing to facilitate this conversation? Not just to give them information, but to give them something to say yes to. Something to act upon. That's what we need to give. This is what JC is doing so brilliantly with Love the Wild. This is the culinary side of this, the RN, the RD side, the policymaker side. This is where we drive home the information that you need. Culinary Institute of America, still working with them. So in short, in summary, these opportunities, these platforms, the continuing conversations we're having, there is blooming interest. And we're putting op-eds in the New York Times. We've been doing 60 Minutes, TED Talks. We're producing a magazine that goes out to chefs. 45,000 chefs will receive our first issue in 3 weeks. We are doing everything we can, and what we're seeing is that there is a welcome and receptive audience. You don't get on 60 Minutes unless they're interested in you. You don't pitch things to them. There is a burgeoning interest. There is a very small little ripple that's beginning to shine, that's beginning to support our efforts. And I'm very excited about that. And I'm very excited to work with all of you to help augment your work, to create new programs, to innovate with SNP, to understand how this work can we can create combinations and permutations of it that can fit into any audience that exists and needs content. Ultimately, we're a service provider translating this work and interpreting it so that we give people something to say yes to, so that we may get more people eating more seafood across all demographics. Thank you.